Hi everyone. Today I want to show you one of my newest books and one that I wanted to show you for the past couple of months. It's directly related to the previous books that we talked about, which are the Shulchan Aruch. This one is called the Torah and is the building block for the halachic writings that led to the Shulchan Aruch, and is also what a lot of people have seen as the culmination of the Ashkenazic codes of Jewish law from the early Middle Ages up until the time that this was written. The Torah was written by Yaakov ben Asher, who's known as the Arba'a Turim, and he was the son of probably the greatest Ashkenazic rabbi of his time, was Rabbeinu Asher. He was born in Cologne in Germany, and he migrated with his father, who was fleeing persecution in Germany. He migrated to Spain, and both of their learning, and specifically the Torah, reflect all of the learning in Germany from the early Middle Ages, the Middle Ages, until the codifying of the Torah in the 14th century, the early 14th century. Also the learning in Spain, and many of the Ashkenazic codes deal only with the Ashkenazic writings, but the Torah deals a lot with the writings of Maimonides and non-Ashkenazic sources as well. So the Torah deals extensively with Maimonides' writings on the halacha and from Maimonides' code, which had spread into Germany at that time and was obviously widespread through Spain, which the Torah was chiefly written in, and the Torah was partially gathered from the learning of Spain and from that time. This Torah is the 1703 printing of the Torah, printed in Berlin. Now, one reason I'd always wanted to get this is the first major edition of any book printed in Berlin. Berlin was to become a large center of printing for Hebrew in all of Europe, but that was later in the 18th century and into the 19th century and in the early 20th century. There had been only a few volumes printed previously in Berlin. That was printed by a Christian Hebraist, Daniel Ernst Jablonski. Jablonski had printed a couple of volumes, one of which I own, and I hope to show it at a future video. His printings had stopped already by 1699-1700, and this was the first one of a Jewish printer to be printed in Berlin. The earliest volumes are dated 1702 and 1703, and this is known as the Torah of 1703 because likely most of it was printed during that year. So the printer for this Torah, his name was Wolf Mirels. Wolf is the Yiddish German version of Zev. He's named here as Zev Mirels. And his father was a very important rabbi. We know who he was because he's documented in many other places. He was a rabbi in Vienna, in Austria. And there had been an expulsion of Jews from Vienna, and he had fled there. He moved to Berlin, and he moved together with his son. That is most likely the reason why Berlin was chosen as the place to print this Torah, because it was by far not one of the great Jewish communities in Germany at the time. It was not very big, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But it was chosen as the place where a major edition was to be printed in Germany, and first in many respects. So Wolf Mirels' father his name was Meshullam, and he was a rabbi in Austria, like I said. His name was Newmark, and I would say he was famous throughout the land. His fame brought him from Berlin a few years later, and he became the chief rabbi of Altona, which is in northern Germany. He moved to Altona a few years after this Torah was printed, and is most famous for being the rabbi in Altona. His grandson was famous also. His name is Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden we'll return to in future videos, but Rabbi Yaakov Emden cites this Torah as being, at the time, his only Hebrew book, And we know that it was the body of work which he wrote his commentary to the Torah to. Yaakov Emden's commentary to the Torah is called Moru Ketsia, and he used this very copy that he received at his wedding. He had an autobiography, it's called Megillat Sefer, and he writes that he received this from what would be his uncle as a wedding present, and he at the time he only owned this one book, and I do know also that he wrote the Moru Ketsia from the margins of this very printing of the Torah. I've seen this volume, and it's in the library in Columbia University, where other books of his library have gone. For this reason only, I wanted to buy this. When I saw this one for sale, I was amazed because of the different signatures and the provenance of this book too. But just for that alone, this makes it amazing. Now, regarding the printing of the Torah, the Torah is one of the most popular texts to be printed in Hebrew. Also one of the first. In 1475, what's known as the first Torah was printed in Pieve di Sacco in Italy. And after that, there were a number of other editions just before 1500. There was a Cincino edition, a Brescia edition. Then there was the first book to be printed in Constantinople, which was a major printing house in the early 16th century, was the Torah. And the Torah was printed in Germany for the first time in Augsburg in 1540, which is an amazing edition. I hope to return to that in a future video. There was another edition in Germany in Hanau in 1609, 1610 by Hans Jakob Hennen, and I covered that printer in an earlier video. I think I mentioned the Torah there. And then this edition of the Torah follows that. Now, there is a difference about this Torah, is that it carries the commentary of Rabbi Yosef Karo, called the Beit Yosef or Beis Yosef. And the Beis Yosef is the basis, and really, as far as Rabbi Yosef Karo is concerned, the extent of his learning on the code. The Shulchan Aruch was highly, highly abridged of the Beis Yosef. And the same thing goes for the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, who wrote the Darchei Moshe, which is also in this edition, which was not in the previous German editions. And the Beit Yosef doesn't appear in the earlier Ashkenazic editions of Prague and Lublin. So this is a major deal for the printing of the Torah and printing of halachic texts in Ashkenaz, in the lands north of the Alps. And so for this reason, it's special for Berlin that they got to have this edition of the Torah printed there, even though the main printing presses of Hebrew in Germany were not in Berlin at the time, and Berlin had a minuscule Jewish community. Berlin is famous for a very fast-growing Jewish community, and it had to do with the king and the elector of Berlin, who I'm going to talk about in a minute. But really, proportionally, Berlin would not be the center where such a volume would be printed. At the time, one of the major printing houses was in a city called Fürth. Fürth was in really Nuremberg, but it was another municipality, and it was an independent municipality, and they had a larger Jewish community there. They had an esteemed printer who was a Talmud Chacham. He was a learned man, and he printed important works there, but he did not print the Torah. And that to me is always a surprising fact, because as far as Ashkenaz is concerned, with there's a heavy load of manuscripts of the Torah and all the other printings of the Torah that have come out of there, you would think that a major printing house would print the Torah, but he didn't, and it was in Berlin where this important Torah was printed. And I mentioned Fürth. I'm going to come back to it because of the signatures and the provenance on this volume. Now, they mention in large letters who was the reigning monarch in Berlin at the time. Many of the books printed in Hebrew will always mention the monarch, as other languages also mention the monarch, but Hebrew does, especially because of the impression of the censor and the impression of the general allowance for printers in the Hebrew printings to be printed. But they always had an in debt to the reigning monarch, and the named king who's on the title page here is Friedrich. Friedrich was the king of the Hohenzollern, and he ruled in all of Brandenburg, but the center of Brandenburg was Berlin, and he was the one who consolidated Berlin and brought together the princes of Germany to an extent, and so did his famous grandson was Frederick the Great, or Frederick the Third. This was Frederick the First. And Frederick the First was actually, to an extent, friendly to the Jews, and he, relatively speaking, was permissive in allowing them to move into the area, to the lands of Brandenburg, and Berlin did grow under his rule. So, in his time, you had the population of the Jews of Berlin until his death. I think he died in around 1709. Till his death, the population of the Jews of Berlin came to 1,000. At the time of this printing, I would assume it was about 500 or maybe a little bit less. And there were a good number of Jews from Vienna, including the printers of this very book. Now, turning the page, so you have listed what's called the Haskamot and the Haramim, okay, which was the old way of copyright, which was that to show that this was permitted in the rabbinic sense of they're doing business, people know about this printing and this is an approved printing, and it wasn't allowed to be copied or mimicked. And there are the rabbis of Frankfurt, of Prague and Bohemia, and other rabbis throughout Germany, Ansbach, Schneitach, and that's usually it. In many of these Charamim of this period, you have different rabbis signing off on books printed in Germany, even if the rabbi was a rabbi way east in the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, or somewhere in the far east of the Western Europe where a lot of these books were printed. But it is very rare to have a book printed in Eastern Europe with rabbis in Germany as signing off on it, which is just an interesting fact. You had some printing limited in areas that are now called the Ukraine and Eastern Poland and things like that, but rabbis in Germany didn't as often sign off on these volumes in the way that they did on volumes printed in Germany, and that is probably due to the fact that Germany at the time was more developed and had a wider network of roads and of travelers, and there was, especially in a place like in the Kingdom of Brandenburg, more people going in and out. By people, I mean people who would be carrying Hebrew books and selling them. There was a trade and there was a demand. This tour all struck me as, what I mean by that is this copy, as being well used, but still in very, very fine condition. And when I saw it for sale, I was just amazed at how well this has been kept up, even though I can see signs of use. There is a spill here from water that's probably 200 years old. There's some marks from wax that have been taken off. That's here. There's different levels of acid in this paper. Some of the paper looks whiter, some of it looks browner, and that has to do with either papers being left in it, or perhaps it was left open for a good while or something. There's different there's different reasons for that. Some of them could be due to the use of it, and some of them could be due just to the different makeup of the paper or something like that. But it's always amazing to see how things survive over this amount of time. This volume is 320 years old. So, it's a lot can happen in that time. And as I'm going to show you, it's been around not just countries, but continents. So it's really traveled, and to survive in such a fashion is fantastic. It's like a really amazing thing. To have survived in any shape is not as much appreciated, were it to be more tattered, but it is still amazing to have at least even pieces of things that old, if it's a book. I'm going to turn now to the provenance of the volume. So on these signatures on the title page, there are different scripts, and I could see that some were older than others, but it all dates around about the same time. The oldest signature is rubbed down, and it looks like it was intentionally rubbed down, and with a light I was able to still read it. And in short, this is the signature of somebody named Lemli Moses. He had a longer, I guess you could say, a last name. It was something more close to the last name of that time, called Rheingonem. Rheingonem comes from a place called Rheingenheim, where he was from, and he was something known as a court Jew, which was that he was a wealthy Jew who was known by the kings and the princes, and he was able to curry favor for the Jewish population. He was a very important, what's called a parnas also, which is that he was a philanthropist, and he supported different Jewish institutions, including he set up what was then famous yeshiva in Mannheim. Mannheim is a city near the Black Forest in Germany, not too far from the city of Stuttgart, and the yeshiva in Mannheim was also started in a way similar to Berlin, not long after the community was beginning to settle and grow there. And Lemli Moses, he gave a number, I think it was about 6,000 or something gulden for the yeshiva to be started. They called it, in German, they called it the Klaus-Stiftung. And this was an institution that grew and grew and was preserved up until its destruction in Kristallnacht. It was totally destroyed and decimated in Kristallnacht, but I can tell you through my professional work that a lot of the books were saved through different means. In the past, I've cataloged different things that were restituted from the Nazi rule and the Nazi seizure of the Jewish books that were from that collection, and a lot of them had been written in by an expert sofer whose name was Rabbi Chanan. Rabbi Chanan was one of the founders of this yeshiva and was there for more than 50 years. And his father was someone named Rabbi Netanel. Rabbi Netanel is one of the owners of this volume, and he has his signature over here. And we know from his signature that he was one of the people from the city of Fürth. He came from Fürth to Mannheim at the opening of this class, and he taught there, and he was someone who was supported by Lemli Moses and his bequeathing of all that money. Back to the signatures, the earliest signature lists Lemli Moses as the buyer of this volume, and I assume that it was probably within a year or two, because it was been rubbed out. I can't read the year that he bought it, but it was probably within a year or two of the printing of this volume, the first decade of the 18th century, and it was signed after in a clear script by his son, who we know through the genealogy and through a book written about the yeshiva by Isaac Una, who was a rabbi in Mannheim many years later. The son who signs this is Isaac Rheingonem, and he signs it in Mannheim. And you have on the side an interesting purchase note in German from somebody who he writes Samuel. And I didn't know who this was, but I assume that this is, as I mentioned, Netanel or Nesanel, as it would be closer to the German, or since Fürth is in Bavaria, it would be closer to the Bavarian Hebrew pronunciation Samuel's somewhat close to Nisano. It's perhaps this or something else, but I look at this handwriting and it's from about that time. Now, despite that this volume was bought for that yeshiva, it was sold off to somebody in Frankfurt a little bit later during the 1730s. His name was Gumprecht Hecht, and we have his signature up here and his purchase note here, and he writes a number of H's here for his last name. And that's just an interesting fact. This is an institution that had a big library, and I don't know why this one got out, but because of the other marks, which I'm about to show you, this one didn't survive the Nazis through the way the other volumes in the library survived. This one came through South America. First of all, this binding, which I noticed, is typical of an Eastern European binding. This shelf mark means it was not part of the library, because I know what their shelf mark looked like. And this binding is what things look like when they come from Eastern Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, those sorts of Hebrew books. And this binding's from about the 1880s, or around that time. There's a leather spine and dark boards. Opening it, you have from the same period, and there's the signature of a rabbi in Porto Alegre in Brazil. There's a signature and a stamp as well. This signature and stamp, at least to me, it appears that it precedes the Holocaust, and the beginning of Eastern European Jews moving into Brazil, Porto Alegre, is about 1915 or 1920, and that's about when this rabbi signs and stamps. His name is Avram Koenig, and he's the Rav of Bet Din, Porto Alegre in Brazil. We have established that it probably moved from Germany to Eastern Europe, maybe to Poland, maybe Lithuania, and through that way it was used and moved down into Brazil across the ocean. Across the ocean again because I bought it from an auction house in Israel, and then it crossed it one more time as it came to me. So the amount of times that this volume has been around the world is really fantastic, and it's survived in a really amazing way. Like I said, you do see stains everywhere, but that's normal for paper made out of cloth, as this is. This is a real treasure, and I am very happy to have it and to show it to everybody. And I welcome questions and comments. You can write them in the comments below. Thank you.